We are in for some really interesting fun with this fourth block for the Kona block of the month. And we're going to walk it through the way that the original pattern is designed, and then I'm going to show you two other options, not four, two. This is going to make it easy. So this is from the original design, and with that they use a lot of half square triangles. So the centers of these pieces are all pinwheels. So for all three that I'm going to show you, we're going to be having a center pinwheel. Now in this one, you're going to see the orientation. When we had talked about it in block number 3, orientation is a little bit important here. Now the next part of it is they build it out with half square triangles, but look at what's happening with this large rectangle they added on there. They put a square with two half square triangles. We're going to explore how to reduce those seams because I'm really adverse to sewing together the same color of fabric. It makes really kind of a bulky addition. So we're going to reduce that down a little bit. And as you can see, this is a fascinating pinwheel that you've got going on here. You've got a pinwheel in the middle, and then you have, I believe it's called a periwinkle star. So if this was all solid, they'd call that a periwinkle star. And so you can get there the way that they're showing you, but it's a lot of sewing, and it's not really necessary to do it this way. So we're going to reduce the stitching down. And as you can see now, it's going together, and it is just plain and simple a 9 patch put together. And you can see the extra seams in there for my seam lines. Now let's try another option. Again, we're going to start off with that center pinwheel, and we're going to have it spinning the way that it's shown on the card. As you're only doing one of these, it's not going to be quite such a big deal, and so it's pretty easy to get it into place the direction that you want it to be. And now what we're going to be doing is we're going to turn that half square triangle in that largest unit. Now these half square triangles that you're building are made out of small half square triangles. And then we're making one large half square of your background, and we're cutting that with a 6.5-inch strip if you're using your 12-inch cube, if you're doing the ones like what's in the instruction. So your smaller half square triangles were cut with a 3.5-inch strip. That larger one is cut with a 6.5-inch strip, and so that's a 6-inch finish. So we're going to do all 4 sides. I like to lay them out as I'm working through this and then put all the units together. And then the corner blocks are going to be 6.5-inch squares of the background. So this is going to give you a better display of the fabric that you've chosen for your pattern. And especially those of you that are using printed fabrics, you want to reduce the seams. So the third option, we're going to show you how to make a chisel. And again, we're going to start off with the pinwheel in the middle. And then we're going to make those half square triangles, those pieced half square triangles out of small pieces. And then we're going to be cutting this chisel. And when we sew this, we're only going to be sewing a partial seam right there. So we're going to start a little ways in on that, on the back of it, and we're going to leave that free on the far to the left. And then from that partial seam that we're sewing, we're leaving it open. And so we've added the first chisel, but it's still open a little bit over by that mustard colored half square triangle. We're going to build the second chisel, and on the second chisel we're going to stitch the entire seam there. So what we're doing is we're working around this. This is not a Y seam. We're working around this piece to be able to fit these chisels in there. And as you notice, the chisels that I've built, and I'm going to show you how to cut those, we have no seam interruption in that, and that makes this a really beautiful way to put your fabrics together. Now we're going to add on that third chisel unit, and we're going to stitch another complete seam all the way over, and we're going to be stitching it, of course, from the back. And the most amount of pieces usually is the one that I put on the top, so I can keep my eye on the direction of those seams. And now we're going to add that fourth chisel. Now when we add this chisel, notice that the piece that's on the top is still not stitched in. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch that up, and then we're going to stitch the last one, and we're going to stitch that final seam in there. Okay, and then we're going to close that out. That unit is going to be all closed out for you to be able to put that together. There we go. Now, as we look at the next part of the unit, we have a decision to make of how we're going to stitch it. We're going to do a test stitch out first, and when we do this test stitch out, I just chose some fabrics, some Amanda Murphy fabrics, to stitch out a test stitch out, and I'm going to try both methods. I'm not going to do the one in the original pattern. I'm real adverse to cutting up all that little fabric. So we're going to show you how to do this with a large half square triangle and squares, and then we're also going to show you how to do a chisel. Now I have some of the units already cut out from the previous project. When I unrolled this, I had some 3-inch finished half square triangles in there, but I'm going to be doing more of them. So we're going to be measuring scraps to see what will work, what won't work. And again, I've got this fabric rolled up. It's scraps that are left over from another project. And so I thought, well, I'll just work with it for this piece. So as I'm following my pattern, I have units that I'm going to be building, and these are all cut for a traditional cut. We're cutting them out of a 3.5-inch strip. And so I took a scrap of fabric. We're going to get it in there a little bit closer for you. And I'm going to be cutting this at a 3.5-inch strip. Even though it's not a long strip, I like using up these little scraps that I have left over. Get everything out of the way. I hate cutting into something that's not meant to be cut. 4 fingers on the ruler, 1 finger off to keep it from pivoting. And then I'm going to slip it around, and now I've got it at 3.5 inches. And I'm going to cut a line so I get that 90 degree. That line is really important because it creates that firm back of my unit for my half square triangles. Now, one of the things I'm not real excited about this technique is that I don't like leaving leftover half square triangles, and so sometimes what it does is it makes it too many of the same colorways. So I'm lining up my half square triangle ruler in there. I've got it along the 3.5-inch mark along the line, and then I'm going to turn that ruler just like I was turning the page of a book, and I look on the back of the ruler and I can see it's on the 3.5-inch line on the back, and it drops off that edge so I have a notch for matching my 1/4 inch. Now we're going to look at the rest of the pieces in here, and as you can see, I'm going to choose an array of different small half square triangle units, and I'm going to make a plan for this as to where I want it to be, because in this particular case I actually did have another printed piece background, so I decided I was going to use that as my center pinwheel. So I'm starting to play with some of the units that I'm putting together in this one. Because I'm only doing one block, I want to kind of make sure that I know the direction this is going with my colors. So I've got my half square triangle in there, and I cut these on my number 12 die, or my number 12 cube, die number 5. And if you're using different sizes of cubes, then that's how that's going to work. And when I trim these units down, I have the notches on both sides. So now I'm going to put a colorway in there. Now when I cut these, I cut them right sides together so that when I go to the sewing machine, they're already paired up. So when I sent them through the AccuQuilt, I had them right sides together to go in there. Now this is the way that the original pattern had this designed. It had you doing this with these half square triangles and then a square in there in the corner. And that's a lot of sewing. You can see that beautiful fabric that we have in there that has this elegant etched hand stitch, the images of what looks like hand stitching. So I would be chopping this up if I followed the pattern as the original pattern was written. This would be really frustrating to me. It's a lot more sewing than we need to do. It's too many seams, and it creates more opportunities for me to lose my points. And so I really don't want to forfeit all of that. So if I was cutting these guys as half square triangles, there we go. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I've got more half square triangles than what I need. So this is how you would be cutting those with that 3 out of the 3.5-inch strip. Now to seal the deal on this one, I need a square that is a 3.5 inch square. Again, this is one of the reasons I really love specialty rulers is that I stay in my same units. So my triangles were cut from a 3.5 inch square, and my squares that match up with it are cut from a 3.5 inch square. I don't have to keep going back and forth and looking at my directions and figuring out what's what. And that's how the original pattern designed it. But you can see all those seams in there would be a lot more seams for one of the smaller units in there. So what we want to do is we want to reduce this down. Now if I measured those would be 3 inches and 3 inches, which is 6 inches finished, which means I have to add a quarter to the top and the bottom. So that makes my strip to cut that unit 6.5 inches. So if I'm cutting that with a specialty ruler, I'm going to cut that big triangle out of 6.5 inches. Or I'm going to cut it out of my AccuQuilt cube. And so it's the die that's the large half square triangle. So let's look at another option to do this. So the corners are just one big square. And again, that's an AccuQuilt square, or it's cut with 6.5 inches. I love this ruler that comes with K. England's rulers. It's the rectangle that has, it's 7 inches. That way then I don't have to try to notice over the edge of the ruler where my 6.5 inch. Now if you notice towards me, I've got my fabric folded up. And then that way it keeps my fabric from wagging on me or having a V in it. And so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to cut it down at 6.5 inches. 3 to 4 fingers on the ruler, 1 finger off. Then I'm going to open it up. I'm going to make sure that I have a perpendicular line on the left side so that I have a nice 90-degree angle on that. And I slipped just a tiny bit, so I'm going to line my ruler back up and fix it. I do not eyeball that. So let's do this. So now what we're going to do is we've got that trimmed out on that one side. And now when I look at my units going together, so this is my half square triangle, and so I'm going to cut that at 6.5 inches. Now this is if I was making this as 2 pieces put together. And then when I turn it over, I can fit that in there. So we're going to swap out those little pieces for one big half square triangle. Look at how much nicer that looks. Great. Yep, get rid of those small pieces. And I'm sure that I'll use those again in something else. And I can play with this a little bit with color. So that's how I'm going to sew them together. I'm going to sew those 4 small half square triangles together. Then I'm going to sew it up against that big half square triangle. And then I'm going to put into the corner a 6.5 inch square. And that will give me the essence of a chisel. So sewing those together will create a chisel. Let's look at what that looks like to cut a chisel though. So if you notice that, that's 6 inches there, and then the unit next to it is 6 inches. So you add them together, that's 12 inches. We add a quarter and a quarter. So to make the rectangle the size that you want it, it would be 6.5 inches by 12.5 inches. And that's how we would start off with making this chisel, and we would sew it up that way, and we would cut the first thing. So I'm going to show you, this is a little trick to how you can use your rectangle, your half square triangle, to cut out that chisel. So the first thing we're going to start off with is cutting ourselves a 6.5 inch unit. Again, I really like working with smaller pieces of fabric because then I'm not always trying to cut off this long strip, and I can use up all the littler bits of fabric as I go along. Any chance you get to use up those fabrics on each unit, best way to go. So we're looking at the one above it and we're seeing this is what it's supposed to look like. So I'm going to take my 14-inch ruler I'm going to lay it down there, and I'm looking on the end of that. I've got a line set up with this so that the baseline of my cut is even with one of my horizontal lines on the ruler. And then I can see along that side, I've got it all set up at 12 1/2 inches. That's how I'm going to cut it. Please do not use the lines on your cutting mat to do this, because your lines on your cutting mat, it's a softer mat, and it's not going to be a square. Now this is what it would look like if I was going to sew that in there. However, I have to leave for a 1/4 inch seam to the right there, because when I put that half square triangle up against it, it is going to take up a 1/4 inch seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to experiment with how can I get that on there to get that piece out. So watch what happens here. This is what's nice about Kay's rulers. And so this is the piece that I want to remove. And this is where I struggled with this, because I'm like, how do I remove that and make sure I don't lose it? And so if you notice, I took that half square triangle, and so I'm going to test cut one first to see what size it's going to be. And so if I try it there, it's going to cut off more than I want it to do. So it's not, I can't use it the way that I traditionally use the ruler. So I've got another way to show you, and the ruler is going to actually look backwards. So notice what we're doing here. So I've got the ruler set up, and if you look at this along the side, on the bottom, right by my thumb there, it says 6 1/2 inches. And then that corner piece is off the edge. This way then, when I sew that piece in, my seam allowance is right there. So I'm looking at my ruler. There it shows the size, and it's right off the edge, so it's a 1/4 inch off the edge, so I get that notch. Down there, that is at 6 1/2 inches, because that's the height of the fabric. And so I'm going to go ahead and trim this off. I'm only cutting one to see what it looks like, and you can see I have the notch on there. So when I sew these units together that I've built out of those small half square triangles, it's going to fit on there perfectly. Now, on my test stitch out, I'm going to show you what this is going to look like. And I actually stitched out 3 of the sides. I did the square plus the half square triangle. And then on one side, I did the chisel. And again, this is my test stitch out. So I want to see what I'm getting out of this. We learn with our hands. Our hands for creatives is one of our best learners. Now this is if I was cutting it out of AccuQuilt. I'd be using from the 12-inch cube, I'd be using die number 1, and then I'd be using die number 3, which is the large half square triangle. These are both 6-inch half finished units. So if you notice, when I sew them together, that's what they're going to look like. And so you're going to get a 1/4 inch seam out of each one of them, and so then it's going to fit together on that. So let's stitch the units into a 4 patch. Excuse me, into a 9 patch. So there's my center that I did, and if you notice, I've got a little different print of background in that one because that's what I had left over. And so I started stitching together. I stitched together my 4 sides of this with my 4 small half square triangles. Look at that beautiful star. It is pretty amazing. And so I can play with this with the color to kind of twist this around while it's sitting here and see if I like the way that that's going. And so you have to be careful that once you move them, that you don't change the orientation of them. Totally different star now, right? I've got one piece in there that's got black in it. Maybe that's not your cup of tea, but sometimes I think we overthink those things. Just get it done. And it's not that, get it done, it's always going to eyeball at you and bother you. It's going to always bother you more than it's going to bother somebody else. So if you notice on the top there, I have one of the units where I put the big half square triangle and I paired it up with a square. And now along the left side, I'm going to add another unit like that. And then on the bottom, I actually have yet another unit, and I only cut 1 chisel for this. Would I do this if this was a finished quilt? Absolutely, every day of the week. It wouldn't bother me one bit. And that really isn't something that I'm lazy about. That has taken me a while to realize that things like that bother me are not worth it. It's really robbing me of my joy. I'm not going to make a test stitch out and put it together. Now, if you notice, what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to line my units up so how I could go to the sewing machine and stitch those out so I don't turn things around. And I am only using my point-to-point turner when I'm pressing these out. Now notice how easy it is to turn this around. So there's my one chisel piece that I got in there. And I'm a little confused about how that top is looking. Well, fortunately, it's, I'm going to turn it around and make it into the chisel. There you go, right? And so I'm going to sew this together as a 9 patch. You can see what's going on there. I'm going to sew the units together horizontally, then I'm going to sew vertical because I do have that one chisel on the far right that I inserted in there. So it's not a true 9 patch. And there it is. Look at how cool that is. I'm very pleased with the way this turned out. Now I want you to notice with this block in particular, I've done this block before in other units, and what's nice about it is you can use those offset corners as we did in our first or second block. And so you can pair them up and put them together in using those corners and into the different pieces. But it was a really fun one to build. And you can see how pretty that looks with that fabric, that kind of busier background. So we're ready to swing on over and give our Kona block of the month one a try. Now I'm going to, when I look at the Kona block of the month, see, do I want to do that center like I did this where I did it with a different fabric? Maybe I'm going to use the Kona fabrics for the center and then use my print fabric for the outer edge. So I did stitch one up and gave it a try to see how I would think about this and see if I thought that was appropriate. So now as I'm looking at this, I'm going through my Kona colors and I'm going to choose. The colors in this one are really gray and taupe and a few charcoal colors. And at first I wasn't sure I wanted to put it up against my light background, but I kind of decided to ignore it. So one of the stitch outs I tried with this was I put together a pinwheel that was just using the lightest fabrics in this section and put it together as the pinwheel. So there I have 2 squares, which means it's going to give me 4 for me to put that centerpiece together. So I'm going to give it a try. If I don't use it in there, I'll find somewhere else to put it. Maybe it'll go in the backing. Maybe it'll go by my quilt label. I don't know. And so for every one of the squares that I put out there, I get 2 half square triangles out of them by putting them on the AccuQuilt die. And that die is listed in your chart. This one I'm making with a 12-inch cube, which makes our finished block 16 inches. So as I go through here and I pull out my pieces and decide how many I want for it, this is what I need. So now I'm stacking them up in stacks of about 6. And as you notice, I put them on the die board at a different angle so that when I go to the cutter, I know how many stacks I have. There we go. Now I'm going to show you how to specialty ruler cut the half square triangles to get that together for all the units. Many of our Kona fabrics are just cut up with the half square triangle. And that's nice because you can get 2 of them on the 5-inch squares, and that does help. It also is going to help your finished piece. Now when I start off with this, I'm going to trim it down to 3.5 inches. I love this little ruler. It's one of Kay England's. It's 4 inches left to right, which is great because if you're using a smaller ruler, you don't have to turn it quite so much. So I've got my 90-degree angle in there, and then I'm going to cut that with the 3.5 inches, and I'm going to make sure that back side of that is at a straight line. I flip the ruler one time, I count up to 3.5 inches, and I have hardly any waste in there at all. There we go, voila. There's my first sets. Now the rest of them, I've got them stacked up for AccuQuilt cutting, and I can send 6 layers through my cutter, and you can work across the way. Now I'm going to go into my backgrounds, and I'm going to be measuring this. This is a little bit more than 3.5 and a little bit more than 4. And so for every square that I put on top of that, I'm going to get 2 half square triangles, which means I counted those pieces, and then I'm going to come back and look at what I have for scraps. So I have to do the backgrounds, and I'm going to use up the scraps first when I'm doing my half square triangles. I need very few half square triangles, but I decided to make the chisels out of these fabrics. So I'm going through my scraps first, seeing how many of them I have. I have to cut these at 6.5 by 12.5 inches. So I need 4 of them to cut this out. So as I look at my scraps, do I have enough pieces to do that? Well, as I laid them out and started looking at them, I realized I had 3. So I only had to cut 1 more strip. And if you notice here, I'm trimming down some of my fabrics because I find it kind of annoying to have weird shaped leftover fabrics. I'm also looking closely at these pieces so that I have them all right sides up. Because my chisels all have to go the same direction, I want to make sure that that orientation is correct. Yes, on batik, sometimes it's hard to tell the right from the wrong sides. You'll look a little bit closer and you usually will see it. And it's not really pronounced on good quality batiks. So we've got a unit that we have to cut that is 12.5 inches by 6.5 inches in order to get those 4 chisels out of there. So it's going 2, 3, 6, 9, and 12 is how many units there were in there. And then you add 1/2 inch so that you have 1/4 of an inch on either side to be able to sew those in. And so we're going to start off with this. And again, I'm studying which side is the right side of the batiks, because once I cut the chisels, they are directional. Again, using my 7-inch by 14-inch ruler, I'm going to cut it almost like a template, frankly. And I'm going to cut that one side off, set it aside, trim it out, always working with the small units first. So I started off with this bigger unit, then the pieces that I have left over, I'll be able to trim out those other pieces. So I'm cutting it out at 6.5 by 12.5. Now those little tiny pieces, not saving those, friends. So now what we have to do is we need our chisels cut in that direction. So I'm going to take and get in there a little bit closer. I'm going to put my half square triangle ruler on there. That's not going to work if I put it the same direction as I normally do it. So I'm turning my ruler over. I'm looking on the bottom. It says 6.5 inches right there, and that point on the top is off by the 1/4 inch so that I leave a seam allowance in here. And again, I stitched out one confidently. I know that when I sew that those little 1/4 square triangles on there, this is still going to measure raw edge to raw edge 6.5 by 12.5. And if you notice, I've got some leftover triangles there, and I can, voila, put them over on that half square triangle because I'm going to need some backgrounds for these pieces. So I'm using up everything as I go along. Much easier to do than figure it out later on. So now I need some more half square triangles, and I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to stack it up as to the pieces that I need as opposed to the pieces that I don't need. And also to inspect what more am I going to need. Now when I'm done with that, I roll it up inside of my fabric and I set it aside because I have plenty to get going on this. Now, as I line these up on my AccuQuilt, I'm going to compare the chisels to the units. So if you notice, with this chisel, this is the square and the large square and the large half square. So if I was to sew those units together, it will be the same size as my chisel that I have built. And you can cut out your chisels by cutting out a 6.5 inch square and cutting the 6.5 inch fabric and then cutting half square triangles. I chose not to. I wanted the uninterruption of being able to have those pieces together. So as I'm sewing this together, this was my first one where I had that center pinwheel, and then I chose to use the light as the background on it to audition it and see what it looks like. up against my other batik fabrics. And I did intentionally put a black piece in there, mainly because I wanted you to see the high contrast isn't going to hurt it. Now, the small half square triangles, or the half square triangles made out of that into the larger half square triangles, I used my background in the middle of that. And you can see it's okay to have that center that way, but my chisels are going to fit in there and make this go together so easily. There's my 4 sides. I'm going to audition it out. I think I prefer the background fabric in there. It's okay to have it that way, the way that I did, but I decided to go with the background. And don't be afraid to go back and forth on that. And that's how I do it, is I'll audition it out. So the first thing I'm going to do is add my chisels, add my half square triangles, the set of four of them together to make that larger half square triangles. And I'm going to attach those to the chisels. And so attaching it to the chisel piece, finger pressing it towards the chisel away from the busier side. Now this time when I sew that in there, I'm only going to sew a partial seam. Remember that partial seam I was showing you before? And so that I keep that far left piece freed up. And it doesn't matter which side you start on, but you want to leave that freed up. So now I'm going to attach on, and you can see it's freed up a little bit. And so what I did was I pulled it up, and I wanted you to see how that little bit, you see how that's not stitched there? That's because when we come around, we're going to be able to stitch that last piece on and not have a Y seam in there. So this is a way to avoid Y seams. Now, when I take that next chisel unit to the right, I'm going to lay it down on the piece, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to stitch it entirely on, so that whole seam to that right from bottom to top is all stitched out. And so now I'm going to add on to my third side. I'm going to add my flying geese units onto that chisel to the third rectangle set. And then I'm going to press it. I'm going to finger press it and use my point-to-point turner. And I take this up and I flip it over right sides together. I make a complete stitch line there along that side because I can. And then I'm going to press it. Now I pressed everything away from that center pinwheel. That I found was, I thought it worked out better. So then I'm going to add my next set of my 4 small half square triangles to my last chisel, finger press it out, and when I finger press it towards the chisel, because then it's the least resistance, lay this down right sides together. If you notice, I tug that first chisel away, out of my way, so that I can do a complete stitch out of that long line. There we go, all stitched out. Now I'm going to flip that first chisel down, and I'm going to pick up and finish that first seam up. So I'm just going to stitch from the corner to that point, and then it'll all be released, and I'll have this nice, beautiful, no interruptions in my beautiful fabric. And it's going to make it so much easier to stitch out. If you're afraid of this method, use the square plus the large half square triangle, and so then you can do that. So if you notice, on this one I got in really close because there were a couple times I was really committed to pressing that pinwheel out away from the pinwheel. I had to twist a couple of the seams. So if you notice, they're twisted like around on the 2 sides of that pinwheel because I really wanted to make sure I had opposing seams on the opposite side. And I couldn't get that, and I wasn't going to change it, so I went ahead and did it that way. Sometimes a seam's got to turn. And so what I'm doing here is I'm getting in really close to show you what that turn looks like. I did this on purpose because I wanted to make sure those pinwheels were there. So that's the point where it's a little bit odd that it's that way. So I'm going to come back, and I did a tiny clip in there, not all the way to the seam, just enough to ease that twist, and use my point-to-point turner to flatten it out a little bit better. Flat on the back of your piece is not as important as you think it is. You're going to put batting in this quilt, and then it will soak up all those things. So clipping the seam, ease slightly, to ease at the turn. And then, as you see, when I go ahead and free this up, I'm going to turn it out. And now I'm going to start looking at this finished piece. Look at how beautiful that is. And again, I've got a really very busy background. If you notice, even the lights in there that maybe you were nervous about, it works. Look at how great it works. Don't over critique this. Don't think you shouldn't have put this there or shouldn't put that there. Notice I only have one of the black fabrics in mine in the center, and I have another one out towards the point. It's more of a charcoal color. I do not get worked up about it. If I love this block, I can go ahead and stitch it up out of something else. I hope that we've inspired you to sew more. This is going to be an easy block for you to do. Don't make it tough. Talk nice to yourself. I look forward to seeing more of what you're doing to be inspired to sew. Thanks for being inspired to sew with us.